Hello and welcome back to the Flip Bama Flip podcast. I am your host, Victoria, and today we are talking all things NQS. Now, if you are not familiar with what NQS stands for, it stands for the National Qualifying Score. And this score, this number, is how teams are ranked, how they are selected for the postseason, and how they are seeded in the postseason. So we all know that gymnastics is a subjective sport. So a gymnast goes up, they do their routine, a judge scores the routine, and the gymnast gets that score. And then we use those individual scores to come up with a team score for the meet. So I guess some people, you could make the argument that an NQS is subjective because it is based on subjective scores, but ultimately how a team is ranked is all about the numbers. Now, this is extremely different. If you follow college football, if you follow college basketball, then you know that at the end of the season, there is always rampant speculation about who's going to make it, who's going to be seeded, what seed, who's going to be facing off against who. And that's in large part because there is not this mathematical calculation like what we have in college gymnastics. You have a committee that is weighing things like wins versus losses, supposed to be factoring in things like strength of schedule. I think basketball does a better job of that than football because they have things like quad 1 wins and quad 2 wins. But exactly how are those uh, calculated and put together and weighted? A quad 1 win versus, a really bad loss. We don't know how the committee weighs those things. And so that's how we end up with surprises. I know at the end of the football season last year, my goodness, there was endless talk about, is Alabama going to be in? Is Notre Dame going to be in? What do we do with Miami, who lost a bunch of stuff, but then beat Notre Dame, who's ranked higher than them? It was a mess. And so one of our saving graces, we have enough problems with scoring. We will have a whole podcast on the problems we have with scoring. But the one thing we don't have is that at least once we have an NQS, it is cut and dry. Who is in, who is out, and where they are. So this makes sense, really, if you think about the sport of gymnastics. And I often will get questions, especially this season. I got a lot of questions from people who were confused because they were really stuck on a wins versus losses and whether or not we won a meet or we didn't. But because everything about the postseason is decided by your NQS, wins and losses don't matter. What does matter is what did the team score on each meet. And so, for example, if you were to score a 197 and win, that goes into the calculation the exact same way that if you scored a 197 and lost. It's a 197, regardless of whether there's a W or there's an L next to it. And so wins and losses really don't matter for anything other than bragging rights, which I think is important at times as well. But as far as are we going to make the postseason and what are we going to be ranked, wins and losses don't matter at all. And it makes sense when you think about gymnastics versus other sports like football. So in football, let's say you have a team that has a good but not great offense. Well, if you play a team that has a terrible defense, your good but not great offense might look exceptional. They might look like they're elite because you played a team that doesn't have a good defense. That same team could play a team that has an elite defense and look terrible, right? So it's the same team, but who you play actually matters. And that's why I think in college football and college basketball, there's a lot of arguments that strength of schedule needs to matter because who you play matters. In gymnastics, you're kind of just competing at the same time and place as another team. And again, yes, there's bragging rights and there's pride and there's all that stuff involved. But gymnastics is really a sport where you're always competing against the 10. The 10 is what you are chasing. And how another team performs, let's say on vault, doesn't affect how you perform on vault. So it's not like the judges have a certain number of 9.9s that they can give out. So if they give the other team 3, then that means there's 3 fewer for them to give to you. Doesn't work that way. So the teams are competing independently. And that's why it would not make sense for a team to count wins and losses because there's nothing that one team is doing that is affecting the other team. And this is why I often got questions about this after meets where we scored well, but we lost. So, for example, when we went to Oklahoma, we performed well. We went to LSU, we performed well. Even though we lost, we had scores that were going to be helpful to our overall NQS. Versus there were also meets that we won. We won the meet at Illinois. That was our lowest, I think, score of the season. And that was the score that we ultimately ended up dropping. And so the score is what matters versus the wins and losses. So prior to this season, the way that NQS was calculated was they would take your top 6 scores. And for most teams, this resulted in your top 3 away scores because 3 of the scores did have to come from away meets. Generally, most teams perform better at home than they do on the road. And so most of the teams, their NQS pool consisted of their top 3 away meets and their top 3 home meets. And of those 6 scores, the top score would get thrown out, and then you would average the remaining 5 scores. That's how a team got their NQS up until this year. This year, they made some pretty big changes. And the first big change was that all the away meets count and go into the pool of scores that could potentially go into your NQS. So you don't get to throw out any of your away scores just because they're an away score and they're not part of your top away scores. And so all your away scores count. And then your lowest 5, not your top 5, but your lowest 5 home meet scores count as well. For the vast majority of teams, this was a non-issue because most teams had only 5 home meets anyway. So they ended up counting all 5 of their home meets. But for a team like Missouri had 6 home meets, which means that they had to, even in this first cut of scores, throw out their top home score. This is a disadvantage. So teams that are going to have more than 5 home meets, they are at a disadvantage because they're not only having to throw out their top home meet score, which for most teams is going to be their top score of the season. Again, most teams score better at home than they do on the road. Alabama was a little bit different. I think our top 2 scores, we had 2 scores of 197.95. We had 1 at home and we had 1 on the road at Auburn. But most teams, their top score is going to occur at home. So if you have more than 5 home meets, you're already throwing out a top score of the season. And then when you have your final pool, all your away meets, your 5 lowest home meet scores, then you're going to throw out the top and the low of those scores and then average the rest. What this means, which is actually quite interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, is that not all teams are counting the same amount of data points throughout the season in terms of their NQS. So a team that has more than 5 home meets is going to have fewer scores in their NQS calculation at the end of the season than a team that only has 5 home meets. So when we look at Alabama, who only had 5 home meets this season, all of their scores, because they count all their away meet scores, and they only had 5 home meet scores, so all of those scores went into the final pool. We threw out the top and we threw out the bottom, and the rest of the scores were average. So every single meet for this team counted. And to me, that's actually one of the benefits of the new system versus the old system, because I've had a bunch of people ask me, what do you think? What do you like? Do you like the old system better? Or do you like the new system? And my question back to them is, well, what do you think an NQS should be telling us about the team? Because if you think that NQS should tell us, what is this team when they're at their absolute best, then you're going to like the old system because that is what it tells us. It kind of cherry picks the best 6 scores and then, again, throwing out the top 1. But then your top 5 scores there are what are averaged. It's telling us, what are you doing when you're doing your best? I personally didn't like this because what this resulted in was basically half of the entire season not mattering. And for me, it was really confusing for teams that were very inconsistent because they might end up with a really high NQS, even though they had some really low points in the season. And so we're going to get to talk about this a lot when we talk about the regionals because we happen to be in a regional with a team that was greatly affected by the new NQS scoring system, and that is Utah. So Utah, under the old system, would have been ranked number 8. They had a really slow start to their season. They're a team that has scored a 198. I think it was a 198.025 back in February. But they're also a team that has 2 team scores in the 195s. They also have 2 team scores in the 196s. Alabama, this entire season, never scored. We're one of 2 teams that has never scored below a 197. And so we would have still been number 5, even under the old scoring system. I did a little exercise where I put all the top 15 teams and I did what would they have been scored under the old system, what would they have been scored under the new system? And 2 teams had significant changes. Utah is one of them. Under the new system, they are ranked number 12, but under the old system, they were ranked number 8. And so it does raise a question about the new system versus the old system, because what is Utah? Are they a team that is inconsistent because they're an inconsistent team? Or are they inconsistent because maybe there were things going on in the beginning of the season and it just took them a little while to step into their groove and iron some things out? We don't know. I will say that they have scored well recently. So it leads me to believe that maybe they were kind of like Alabama was last year. If you think about the Alabama team last year, we had a slow start to the season. Well, we started actually the very first meet, but then we had some outside factors that affected us. We had a couple of meets where the team had been sick or the team caught the flu. And I remember one of the meets we went to Kentucky and I think we scored like a 196.1, right? That wasn't really representative of how the team was. But under the new system, we would have had to count that score versus last year we were able to drop it because it was one of our lowest scores of the season. But again, it really comes down to what do you think NQS should be telling us about a team? Should it tell us what is the team's ceiling? Or should it tell us that over the course of the season, on a week-to-week basis, who is this team? Are they a 197 team? Are they more like a 196 team? And again, I think the one downfall is what do you do with the teams that have extenuating circumstances that affect their performance during the season or who build throughout the season? Because I can tell you right now, Utah doesn't feel like a 12th ranked team. They feel much more like an 8th ranked team than they do a 12th ranked team. And unfortunately for us, we've got to go against them in regionals because they do have a 12 next to their name. That is what their calculation was. The other team, and I'm going to take a look at my notes real quick. The other team that got moved was Michigan State. So Michigan State is ranked 11th now. They would have been ranked 9th under the old system. And so Arkansas, who is currently ranked 9th, would have been moved to 10th. Missouri, who's ranked 8th, would have been moved to 10th. And then all the other teams after that would have been kind of just slotted a little bit later. Michigan would have gone from 10 to 12. And then Minnesota, Cal, and Clemson would have stayed where they are, which is 13th, 14th, and 15th. But you can see, so the top of the rankings stayed the same. And the bottom stayed the same, but in the middle, you did have movement because you did have some teams that were up and down throughout the season, and now they don't get to throw away those. But again, I keep going back to the idea that I don't, at the heart of it, like the idea that most of the season didn't matter in the old meet, in the old way that you would calculate NQS, and that you would actually get to a point of the season where your NQS couldn't get any lower. It could only get higher. And so there was not really a way for a team to move up, or there was not really a way for a team to move down. So for us this season, that kind of backfired because we moved from 4th to 5th, but it was because UCL up because they had such a high score in their conference championships, which do count towards your NQS. But that is NQS in a nutshell. And it's why things like wins and losses don't matter. It's why the reveal show was pretty boring because we all knew what was going to happen. But it is ultimately how teams are placed. I don't think that there's going to be any changes to the system moving forward, at least not in the upcoming years or the years coming up soon. So this is kind of your guide to how to calculate it this season as well as in future seasons. We'll see how it goes. I'm sure that, again, there's no system that's perfect. So there might be some tweaks that they make to account for some of the things that we don't like. For example, how do you calibrate it for a team that is inconsistent or a team that comes across some injuries but then recovers and by the end of the season is doing really well? But we don't have that fixed. We are where we are this season. And this NQS, Alabama ended with, let me get the exact number. Our NQS this season was a 197.498. Under the old system, it would have been a 197.64. Again, we still would have been ranked in that 5th position, so we would not have changed. But our NQS is lower this season than it would have been last season. And that is consistent for every single team that I did this for. And it makes sense when you think about the math involved to it. If you get to throw out your low scores like we did in the past, your average is going to be higher. But that is NQS in a nutshell. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments or send me messages. I'm happy to answer them and try and make sense of NQS and scoring. We will have a podcast about the regionals that Alabama is headed to. We'll have one about scoring and a bunch of other things. And so we hope that you join us for those. Until then, roll tide.